Good evening, everyone. Are we ready and set? Yeah? Okay, great. You ready? Yes. Good evening. I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to tonight's event, a collaboration between the Ornamental Metal Institute of New York, which has generously sponsored the lecture, and the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture of the Cooper Union. We've enjoyed this collaboration for many, many years, with Gary Higbee leading the efforts on behalf of both the Ornamental Metal Institute and the Steel Institute of New York. With significant engineers and architects, from Hanif Kara to Kazuyo Sejima, and Robert Silman to Christian Keres, you may wonder how speakers are distributed between structure and ornament. When I served as dean, we struggled for years trying to second-guess whose sensibilities or ethics would be most challenged if designated to the wrong category. No laughing matter, the quest for irreducibility in architecture emerges not only from what is essential to support a building, but equally so to represent how it is supported. The morality bestowed on the truth of a building the morality bestowed on the truth a building might communicate is also set behind this predicament, with structural purists making claims to a higher truth than those whose invitation to a more nuanced understanding of tectonics engages the inevitable ambiguities of representation to speak a more complex truth, that the skins of buildings are arbitrators of a more multifarious task, not only in wrapping, protecting, or clothing the building, but also to somehow disentangle, compartmentalize, and prioritize how the content of a building might communicate itself onto the outer surface. An inconvenient truth to the moralists of alleged structural purity in this equation, ornament may be all that matters after all. With this as backdrop, I have not confirmed yet whether our esteemed speaker tonight, Kersten Geers, is silently seething inside in contempt of being robbed from the structural title and instead having to wear the badge of ornament. But I will try to build the case on his behalf in this brief introduction with the hopes he may be convinced. With a body of work, Kersten Geers shares with his partner, David Van Severen, they go under the banner of KGDVS. There are three concurrent protagonists operating in their work: the concept of type, the presence of the figure or the Platonic shape, and the overlay of the diagram. We can debate whether these categories work in harmony or dissonance, but it's worth rehearsing some instances that display the complexities that are born out of their co-presence. And here I apologize because I will be referring to projects that some of you will know, others may not, but hopefully you'll be presenting some of these tonight. With the villa in Linkenbeek, the villa in Bugenhout, and the city villa in Ordos, the idea of type connects them to a well-trodden lineage from Rossi to more contemporary practices, where the obstinance of spatial redundancy, essentially through repetition, produces an inverse flexibility with the ways in which program may otherwise inhabit these structures. Disciplined in their allegiance to historical antecedents, these villas also reveal the latitude of transformability. What is the conceptual leitmotif of type itself, its ultimate capacity for malleability. If the figure were not already present in the idea of type, the lexicon of Platonic shapes that form their vocabulary produces a form of dissonance that is entirely alien to the type itself. A classic architectural problem, the mediation between the square and the circle, the four attenuated wedges of the solo house are at once attendant to and entirely indifferent to the circular figure they occupy. And that is entirely the source of invention of the solo house, what would otherwise be just a nice courtyard house. Translated to the urban scale, this strategy is only radicalized in Lausanne's media house, where the organic figure of the amoeba allows otherwise untethered rectangular typologies to coalesce into one organization. Unable to do so within the constraints of the grid, the introduction of triangulated tangents, what are the trusses, connect these figures to cohere as one, bringing us to the question of diagram. Neither just a building, nor completely a city, the figure and configuration of this project are at total odds with each other. No typological description could adequately capture the organs, arteries, and skin of this proposal as such. If Lausanne displays the virtuosity of the architects, the idea of the diagram may be more simply illustrated by the crematorium in Ostend, where the striations of the plan, oscillating between served and servant spaces, are offset by the figure of the roof that hovers entirely independently of the programs it protects. Two orders, both legible, neither confined by each other, gain resonance by the residual spaces created on the outer edges, forming essentially porches, engaging landscape as collateral benefits. The type, the figure, and the diagram do not present themselves as alibis, nor do they lean on history, rationality, or optimization as justification. They merely coexist as latencies, opportunistically borrowing from each other towards a more complex set of results. So, what do they, the type, the figure, and the diagram, have to do with ornament anyway? In a practice that is often described as minimal in its typological palette, reduced to essentials in its material vocabulary, and edited of any rhetorical surplus whatsoever, we also see the impossibility of a conventional morality. Returning to the villa in Bugenhout, the immaculate legibility of its conceptual orders suggests a set of priorities born not so much out of material optimization, nor budgets, nor typological allegiances, but only conceptual fidelities. We witness an offset fence whose boundary redefines the property for an outdoor room, and whose cladding serves as infrastructure for greenery. A concrete base evacuated of outer walls to centrifugally unleash each space towards its newly created corresponding outdoor rooms. And then an internal world on the second floor, independent of the first, clad entirely of raw plywood, a millwork scope that belies the affordability it communicates as signifier. The subtleties at work are many, but also a mainstay of this special collaboration, walking a thin line between appearances of opposite tendencies, essentialization on the one hand and mannerization on the other, with actuality and expression speaking to each other in a dead-on collision. I've never had a chance to share a platform with Kersten before, this despite having led the jury to their pre-mated Daejeon project some 20 years ago in Korea. Thus, it gives me particular pleasure to be able to host him here tonight, putting forth some of these questions and conjectures with less context than he's deserved. With that, please join me in welcoming Kersten to the stage.
Thank you, Nader. I must say it's almost a lecture in itself. I will show some illustrations. My thought when you were talking was that perhaps you're just telling me that we are dirty, which is probably true, but that's maybe for after this lecture. So this lecture has a title, and the title is, if I manage to get it, yeah, Architecture and Everything. Yeah, I mean, these titles, they always come too early. When people ask for a title, then you come with a title, then later you figure out what you will talk about. And so it's also like this today. And at the same time, architecture and everything is so many things we've been dealing with. David, myself, our office, but also the context of our teaching. And so much so that everything um, as a teaching context has been very much inspired by this work, which is this one of the many works which are called Tutto by Alighiero Boetti. And these Tutto works, which are essentially embroidery of figures, all of them together creating some kind of white noise of everything at the same time, but every element itself totally discernible, has been the background for, as you can see here actually, for many, I would say, publications, little projects, all related to what we've been doing in our teaching in Switzerland, more recently in Mendrisio. Now, everything as such is, of course, the world. It's also, to a certain extent, the problem that one, as an architect, is almost unable to find a proper answer to it, despite our desire to be responsible. Everything's so big that whatever you do, you might end up making one of these little figures. So I guess everything, to a certain extent, is what happened after we've been doing architecture without content, which we've been doing many years prior. We started here at Columbia University, and then gradually it became a project of almost 33 episodes. But when 3-4 years ago, you believed that it was time to move on, everything was born. And everything is, of course, on the one hand, well, everything. Everything is architecture, as we all know. I mean, this kind of infamous or famous statement. But everything is also, to a certain extent, a collection of thoughts of where can we put the flag and what can still be architecture. I think it's a desire to stretch our understanding of, is this still architecture, or is that still architecture, or do we still like this, or is this still a figure, or is this still a type, if I use what has just been said before. And from that perspective, it was a context in which we have been working on the one hand on what we've been calling for many years with our friends of San Rocco, the even covered field, but then maybe is simply called, and increasingly I would like to call it, the large city, which is a place which is somehow all urbanized and where no real hierarchy still exists, and which looks a little bit like that Boetti um, artwork. Now, this everything as a context, as a place where one tries to understand the size of architecture, the function of architecture, the reality of architecture, or perhaps its sole function to create reality. And I think increasingly for us, this desire that architecture creates reality, maybe in opposition to virtuality, or reality as an answer to all these almost non-tangible things which are surrounding us, that's more and more, I think, the core of our investigation. So from that perspective, when we were working some years ago on the difficult whole of Venturi and Scott Brown, then we've been working through these various incarnations of everything on this on the um, Urban Fact by Aldo Rossi. And in each of these investigations of architects and their own particular part, a very small particle of their oeuvre, I think it was more to do to what extent a certain urban idea would coincide with an architectural idea. And I think this Urban Fact is, I would say, a clear example in that we were only focused on projects which were made in northern Italy and which were more or less coinciding with his work, Architecture of the City, but which, in opposition to what perhaps was commonly understood, was not so much a desire or projects which had a desire to repair the city as found, but rather to mediate an idea of cityness in a place where the city wouldn't even exist. So from that perspective, architecture and everything is every time again putting this flag. So if more recently we made this book on the, I would say, the late work of Aldo and Hanni van Eyck, we were interested to what extent is work post the orphanage, work which was to a certain extent um, slightly overshadowed by its weird color palette, you could say, that very work was perhaps an investigation, and this Aztec campus is fantastic. It's a kind of, actually it's the ESA headquarters in The Hague, or close to The Hague in the Netherlands, where in a way, the architecture of interior is, I would say, developed as a hypothetical answer of this impossible everything world outside. So if we take all these elements, Rossi, Venturi, Scott Brown, Van Eyck, we recently worked on Giancarlo Di Carlo. And if we take all these little flags of some people we really like and others we don't like so much maybe, but we learn to like, and others which we thought we hated, but in fact we embraced and we love now. I mean, if we take all these little elements together, we can get started. So we start here. And we start with a project which, and it was introduced to a certain extent, which I guess was a project which was born differently, but which I increasingly start to understand as a project of, I would say, the investigation of an interior. So is it possible to embrace the logic of interior, the, I would say, almost too much architecture, as you can see here, as a hypothesis to answer this bleak world of everything outside. So this is a project we are currently building. It took almost 10 years to get to that point, but okay. It's a learning center. Sorry, next to the learning center, it's a radio and television building, the RTS in Lausanne. It's next to the learning center of Sanaa, of Sejima Nishizawa. It has a very specific site because of that. You can see it here. It's part of the campus of the EPFL, which is here, and the UNIL, which is there. It's next to this set of buildings, which is here the learning center, this under one roof. And then this, in some weird way, in the kind of urban planning logic, belongs to this set. It's supposed to be a big building, which is part of university, but partly doesn't really belong to the educational facilities. It's kind of a more public figure. At the same time, in fact, it's not university at all. It's radio and television. It's a broadcasting building. And it's there because somehow the university itself could not develop this area further. I mean, the master plan did not allow with more educational facilities, and they already had plenty of surface, which, I mean, had a very light density of use, which is of course also very beautiful, but also very expensive. So they decided to sell this lot to the radio and television company under the condition that maybe there would be some kind of collaborations in the future when the building would be built. At the same time, it's Switzerland, and people think Switzerland is beautiful. It has mountains and lakes and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, it's just a pavillionaire, as it's in French. It's the French-speaking part of Switzerland. It's just small houses. And then there's this, in a way, ridiculously bizarre set of kind of almost print plate-like buildings, which all of them are very beautifully made, but in some sense also totally soulless. And then there's this idea of campus. This is kind of campus, which is the UNIL is the university, and the EPFL is the technical university, and is building somewhere sitting there in between. So here there's a couple of pictures, and I realize I have 11 projects, so I will speak a bit faster. So I guess for us, initially, and in this notion, this everything, as I was just talking about, we were interested in asking ourselves, to what extent can you make a surface, a place, an interior, which belongs to the radio and television, and even though it lands there in this very particular context, there's also a desire to be ignorant. So that's, I would say, that model picture. So this enormous plate, kind of non-stop idea. You can see it here, of course, as I mean, a weird mixture between non-stop city and say the Campo Marzio. I mean, of course, it's none of the two, but in some of its way, it kind of tries to be, and it was so beautifully formulated by Nadar, I think, tries to be city, but it knows that by doing so, it will always fail. It's kind of a desire for being a city on its own right, but in a way it's too small. And of course, a city you do not build in one go and not in one architecture, even though, I mean, there were architects, I mean, 50, 60 years ago who thought so, but I guess we do not think so anymore. So this kind of figure with this desire for endlessness lands in a place which is far from endless because it's cut by an existing building. And then, I mean, in some way, we quickly realized that the only way to give that suggestion the maximum effect was to kind of also cut somehow the corners. It gives this kind of weird ear shape or piano shape or whatever you want to call it. It became all kind of things, and it was not intentional, but it's nice and it's somehow beautiful, we think. But it was ultimately just a reaction to this, and then the desire that maybe instead of radically cutting, kind of getting rid of any single angle would give that suggestion to of endlessness to maximum effect. So here you have a couple of these thoughts, and these are first schemes which we did. You see the dates also in 2014. Can you imagine? It's the first version of the project. I mean, and then, there's a bit of Baldassare because we like him and then we always use him in some sense. And we also did that in 2014 already, I guess. But either way, so I mean, this is a beautiful figure in the sense it's this kind of square, which of course is many of the many works he did that way, which I mean hides, of course, one of the major aspects of that picture as it was. And through that, there's this weird tension in this picture, and there's a kind of a figure ground. So we thought, is it possible to make this endlessness, this kind of interior, but you interrupt it a bit like this Marcho plan does, perhaps? And because of that, I mean, it becomes even more urban. I mean, the interior is urbanized with the presence of the interruption. I mean, that was the thought. And you see that it was like interrupted by 5 and then maybe by 4. And then indeed, of course, um, because contemporary radio and television, at least in Switzerland, is made by high-tech trucks, strangely enough, almost plug-in city-like. What do? They drive around in Switzerland. They come down here. They plug them in on these big holes where they record their mobile studios. And the moment a certain kind of recording is finished, they use them again for a news item somewhere else. So despite the fact that it's a kind of a creative surface, like a gigantic open place to work, interrupted by boxes which have closed places to record, let's say. At the same time, it's also almost like a fire station, like a place where trucks and cars and things park and are somehow semi-protected. And so these two, in a way, desires. I mean, you see them come out here. I see the recording studio, very early collage, 2014. You see that kind of fragment of a truck. And then this idea that that very device which would place the truck, protect the truck, would also make some kind of space on campus. Because of course, it's like it starts from inside and it all of a sudden makes a kind of an idea, or it has an idea of a kind of semi or kind of fake urbanity outside. So this is the competition plan. You see this in a way big field. You see these 4 interruptions boxes. I mean, the competition was 8 months with 3 or 4 phases. So this was a last phase plan. And then you see this indeed, as has been mentioned, you have all these trusses which carry this big ear, which is a mise-en-scène of endlessness, as I tried to explain to you, which is this workspace which sets towards the north. And then I always seem to miss my connection. And here, if you go down, the consequence of that is these boxes which are, I mean, organizing all of a sudden a bigger space. We work here together with the landscape designer Bas Smets. And of course, with the big neighbor of the learning centers, very flat, but at the same time, in a way, very undefined, beautifully undefined figure, to which there's this weird answer of these boxes, which in a way are almost like micro campus like. I mean, in fact, not so micro, they're quite big. The building is just very big. So in some way, just 4 buildings which happen to accidentally carry another building, which is the one you see here. So then, I mean, what's interesting here perhaps is that this architecture of an interior is not, of course, an architecture of everything goes. And I guess in our work, and it's funny to start with, I never started with a big building like that in a presentation. You always start with a house or something, but thought it was fun not to do this today. Um, what you see is that these buildings, in all these phases, they evolve. I mean, in 10 years' time, the boxes remained at the same time boxes, and at the same time, their plans became, in a weird way, endlessly redesigned. Because, of course, what happens with media, and this is in a way a current plan with a section of the competition. So you see it even, you can confuse everybody with this. Essentially, the decision was simply to make four, what we called in French émergence boxes, one big plate like the champ, the field, this kind of shedded kind of working space, and then the space which is the consequence under it with the lobby in the middle and all this kind of almost traffic space. You can see it here, which is simply happening under it. And everything changed apart from the very definition of these four figures. And even though the architecture was in a way hyper-defined, it was extremely open. So somewhere between without content and kind of a hyper formalism, I guess. So I guess there the ornament goes. So here you see a kind of image which we use now to show the client how the building will be really now when it's finished in a year and a half. So here you see it in the inside. And then, oh, it goes too fast. And that's the champ as it is when there was still orange floor. Now the floor is kind of weird green gray. I mean, in Switzerland, you have to make mock-ups for everything and test 300 times every element. So also the floor was the victim of that, but that's okay. And then here you have the building as it is. I think these are pictures, and I mean, I mention it now. I mean, all pictures you see in this presentation are by Bas Prinsen. Even these construction site pictures are by Bas Prinsen. So here you see that. So in a sense, and that we thought was interesting. So you have a building which is at the same time extremely complex. It's these boxes which carry a big plate, which is carried by these trusses, which on itself has these big sheds which are towards the north, and all the geometries have to kind of follow in some sense. And this at the same time, it makes an extremely complicated space, as you can see here. So this is, well, these are the, well, this is a structure. But because all of this is there, there's nothing else. So everything you see here in this picture, you will see when it's finished. I mean, this is the final version of the shed. These are the final versions of the trusses. They're painted against fire, yeah, against fire. I mean, they're not all white. Some of them will be dark green, some of them be white and gray, and some red. But this is in a way really what it will be. And you see that here also. And so you have a kind of architecture which is on the one hand extremely Spartan and perhaps honest, and perhaps at the same time extremely dishonest and mannered and surreal in some sense. So as a kind of mise en scène of an interior and of a city perhaps on itself. So you go, you stay up here, you have start to have the views here towards the learning center, and then you go down where this enormous, in a way, plate is kept up by these emergences, by these buildings left, middle, and right. There's three glass lines which make a distinction between inside and outside. So here you will have all these trucks, which even have their own garage here in some sense, and which then connect to these halls to record. And there's a stair hanging, as you can see. So you see one more image like that. And then here you see it from the learning center. This is a picture a few weeks ago. And then I think there's one more. If this computer wants me to show this, okay, here. So what I find fascinating is this building, which is entirely developed from its inside, ultimately is of course trying to seek for an answer, a kind of negotiation with its extremely specific context, as you can see that here next to the Sanaa building. And it's exactly there where I believe this architecture and everything, at least in my mind, was born. So here you see still the site without the building. Here's where the building is now under construction. And here you see the site, and you see that despite the mountains, despite the lake, despite this kind of promise of nature, it's just all urbanized. Everything, everything is just taken. Every piece of land is occupied. It's just not occupied because they couldn't. They couldn't occupy this. That's why it's not occupied. That's the only reason, and hence it doesn't make it so different from this, which is Belgium. It's not every part of Belgium, but I mean, this is Charleroi, the south of Belgium, so the French-speaking part. And everything here is also occupied. You see that? And there's also hills or nature, you would think, but in fact, the hills are artificial. They're all part of the remnants of the kind of coal and steel industry. So they're terrils, they're like this artificial mounts, but which are not anymore black, as you can see. They became nature because the last 50 years they have been untouched. And there's 36 of them everywhere here in Charleroi, and they became the major natural context of the city. Now, this is another of these large cities, another of these endless sprawls, and it's in this sprawl that we were asked to design a satellite factory. So not a satellite factory, but a factory where you build satellites. So okay. So, that's the satellite factory. I mean, of course, you can understand the satellite factory is like a media building. I mean, you cannot represent, or at least that's what we think, you cannot represent media in a media building, and you cannot represent satellites in a satellite factory. In a way, they're just the same thing, just some buildings are bigger, some are smaller, halls are higher, halls are lower. So here, the satellite factory. So interesting, back to Charleroi. Charleroi is this, you see, it's kind of, you could say it's a place which has been neglected for many years. I mean, it has been understood by many politicians as the worst, that kind of, I mean, if your ex-president talked about Belgium as the, what was it again? Something like the hellhole of Europe, I guess then this was probably the hellest of them all in some sense. Now, Charleroi has even not been liked by national politicians. Now, it is true that the current mayor is the head of the Belgian Socialist Party, and the French-speaking Socialist Party, because in Belgium everything has a language, it's always complicated. And he's extremely ambitious and wants to turn this place into what he calls himself a laboratory for urbanism. I have the tendency to think he might be right. It's the right moment. 50 years after this industrial boom, with nothing left but these weird hills and none of these factories anymore working, and only 300,000 inhabitants and only fragments of buildings, you can just somehow not forget this image, which is interesting. We all know this image, of course, this green archipelago, Ungers and Koolhaas and Riemann and Koloff and Novaska. Interestingly so, this kind of figure, this idea that a city so light in kind of occupation, but so big in territory, could maybe become in a kind of post-pedelec speed bike kind of world where everything is electrified and 10 or 15 kilometers is nothing, could maybe become a place where people would like to live because a lot is available. So post Beggars towards the city, um, rethinking what is place, what is nature, what is size, what is figure. Now, I do not think our project is able, of course, so often architecture projects are not able to push all this to the limit. That's also why in parallel now with the students in Mendrisio, we're working on this site. We call it the large city. We've been working one semester, we'll work the next semester on this large city, Charleroi. We're making these drawings. We are realizing that all these hills are there, all these terrils. We try to understand them as, in fact, as potential park, as nature, as figures which make you understand the urbanity and its possibility in a completely different way. So where these elements are perhaps similar in potential as these other elements, which are these big boxes, these weird leftover machines, this strange oversight pieces of infrastructure, and so forth and so forth. Now, this just for context. This is a building which is big enough to perhaps belong to these boxes like thing. It's a new building. It's this, as I said, the satellite factory. It's here. It's a project which came to us when they already did 3, 4 attempts and they made just boxes and nobody was satisfied and it did not answer to, I would say, the desires of also the mayor. It's a building in a context which is, I mean, as trashy as you just saw it, with here a couple of housing slabs and then a bit of small houses, and then here a couple of very big buildings and a little fragment of lost forest, and then here, in a way, a beautiful building. I hope that the next, well, here is first a kind of an idea of what its size is in this sense. I mean, so, well, we asked to do offices and then the factory itself, the mega factory, they call it. I guess they were inspired by your famous American entrepreneur. Either way, so the satellite thing was supposed to be this. These are a couple of buildings we've been designing and doing, so we realized it was quite big in comparison. And that's a building we actually won and designed but never built. So we thought, oh yeah, we can do that, somewhere we can handle this. But what I wanted to say is that there was this building on site, this one here, which is actually, it was a beautiful administrative building, typically late 1960s curtain steel architecture, exoskeleton, impossible to keep up. Because if you want to renew it, if you want to renovate it, sorry, that's what I wanted to say, you have to kind of find a solution to the cold bridges, inside, outside, how to do an office. Of course, the clients already decided we just demolish it. We put a new building, and then we do the parking next to it, and then here is the big box for the factory. We somehow convinced them to not do this. We said, look, the building is really nice, but you cannot just kind of reoccupy it. But if you take away the kind of the major skin, you keep the structure, it could become a structure in its own right, becomes the parking. We add a ramp to it. And so at least we don't have to get rid of this beautiful forest for cars. It would be sad. So in a sense, making a micro patch of that bigger vision of Charleroi. So more trees, keeping buildings, building new buildings. So since the office is not here, they are there. And because of that, we could invent somehow, you could say, the bridge from the cars, obviously all electric in 2030 in Europe, to the other side, where then the offices are on top of the clean room. Oh, I go too fast. So here you see that again. That's the figure. These are the offices. This is the parking, this is the ramp. It was at the very beginning even a set of elevators, but they were scared of elevators. And then the bridge. So here you have a whole set of, in a way, openings, holes. Some are other openings, some are patios, some are, in a way, toilets, meeting rooms, all kind of things. And here you see that. So in a sense, it's just, trying to find a figure which is able to deal with the scale. So it's a gigantic interior again, but of course an interior which immediately understands the consequence of its size. So it is there, it's simple, it's ununderstandable, it's somehow opaque, but not entirely. I mean, the crematorium, we'll see it later, has this kind of facade which is corrugated, perforated aluminium. So we come with that. It works, it comes more or less like this. So these are a couple of images of the building as it has now been developed. Actually, we will start building it in a few weeks. The permit is there, the contract is there, it's all there. So they will build this. So of course, they're the most afraid of this. They have been doing many analysis on this building and it seems like it will hold. Let's hope it's true. And then there's this, the bridge and then the factory itself. Here. So, of course, for us, it was interesting to kind of find an architecture which is at the same time, would say, mysterious and clear. So, is the box super pragmatic, very cheap in a way also. It's Charleroi after all. There's and that's also good, we think. There's the infrastructure which keeps the box running, and then there's in a way the facade which kind of holds it all together. You see that here. the backstage in a way, the logistics, the machines, the display space, the entrance, the subspaces, the side offices, and so forth. And then the office rooms, the office, in a way, one enormous, in a way, field. Strangely comparable to what you just saw before, but simpler, different, a big field of working spaces. See it here and here. Here's this white room, and here you see the bridge again to the parking. And voila, so here's this context, this Shalom. So using it to fade out and sticking to this field, I thought, and I'll do it quick because otherwise you will sit here until like 11 in the evening, which is probably too late. Um, is this idea, this notion of field, and of course this notion of artificial nature. So as I said, the nature here is artificial. Nothing what you see has ever, is real nature. The hills are terrils. This is leftover industrial area. Everything is artificial, which is fantastic. So you have a nature which starts to look as real as natural as one imagines nature, and realize that nothing is the case. Now, this nature is also artificial. This is a plantation. It's an old project of ours, but it was interesting. Also, let's not forget we're having the steel people here and these aluminium people. More aluminium and more steel, but more trees as well. So this is Drying Hall. It's a building we did in 2012, 13, I think. So almost 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And I do think that in some sense it's the ancestor of what you just saw. So where there, it was like almost like as if it was a model, a kind of a first attempt to make a big box, an architecture without content, coincided with the teachings here at the neighboring school at Columbia, where we started architecture without content and this kind of theory of the big box in some sense. And of course, what we were fascinated by in how a box could become more than just this box, and what it could be. Was it the silhouette? Was it the extrusion? Was it the false perspective? Was it simply enlarging a kind of common object like you see here with Rita McBride? Or what could you do to make a box go beyond the box and give it a kind of sense of responsibility, a kind of dignity, which we believe was fundamental. So here you see more of these thoughts from our kind of old tutors and important ancestors ourselves, Abalos and Herreros, to this kind of hypothetical, endlessly pursued mastaba by Christo and Jean-Claude. So essentially, it was a simple project of facade. So architecture reduced to, only its perimeter, and the decision to make that perimeter somehow semi-translucent, corrugated, self-structural, as you can see here, um, as a kind of standing, fixed, stiff curtain. So this is how it was, and this picture by Bas is in that sense, beautifully confusing. You do not fully understand the geometry. It has a couple of doors. They're all different in size. Related to the size of the trucks which have to enter. It has trees inside and trees outside. So in a way, nothing is different inside and outside. So it's kind of the 0 degree of architecture. So, there's nothing to it, but the very fact that it exists. You see that here. Now, using this as a kind of architecture so simple and reduced, and perhaps already an illustration about what the satellite factory could be, but then of course very different with a different context. I believe I could jump through the artificiality of a very similar site. Outside what we consider in kind of conventional terms the city, but still the city. This Drying Hall is urbanized space. Every tree you saw around it is essentially a planted tree, is designed, is taken, is artificial, as I just mentioned. Well, here, this set of artificial hills in an artificial lake with another artificial part of grass, which is polders, which artificial land, is the context of this building, which is the crematorium in Ostende, which a building which we won about, I think 8 years ago, and we finished about 3 or 4 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe something like that. and deals very much, very well, I think, or very much in the same way with that kind of strange developing context. It's a context we have started with the RTS in Switzerland, where maybe starting from the interior, start to realize how a building of that scale deals with context and understands also that despite its enormous size, it can't do much, but that the context is almost somehow dirty and urban. And even when you think it's not so urban, like here, it is of course artificial to the bone. So outside of a city called Ostende, but next to another village which belongs to the conglomerate of villages which in a way make Greater Ostende, was decided to do competition for a new public building, a crematorium. Now it's interesting and important, I think, to make us understand that it's a new public building and that today people do not make so many designs anymore for public buildings. I mean, and also buildings of that genre, crematorium, you could say, replaces at least partly what used to be projected on buildings like a church. Not the same, not the same at all, and without the specific coloring, but nevertheless a building which has a specific role in a certain moment in people's life, even in this case, regardless their kind of their convictions. So at the same time, a crematorium is also this building. And when we were busy with this architectural content, we were very interested by that. A building which is in a way pushed outside of the city because nobody really wants to live very close. Like they used to move cemeteries in Europe very much outside of the city, of course, to the point that later the city kind of took over, the territory close to the cemetery, so that now these old cemeteries typically are part of the greater parts of our larger cities. Well, this large city of Ostende, in a way, is already having its crematorium on its territory. It's here. It's next to a road. It's part of a very big boulder landscape, which is currently not planted at all. This is a kind of landscape master plan, you could say, by Bas Metz. It's part of this competition, as I said, where we're trying to understand how does this building, in all its particularities, how can it find a way of expressing the non-expressible? So, of course, I mean, well, here you have a Matt Mulliken work, but I mean, essentially we thought, and you see it with all of these many tests, and we come back to this set of parallel lines later, but was it possible to a certain extent, and I go a bit further, yeah, to find a way of expressing, you know, the dead, but without being too literal. And we thought what was interesting is to see the building as a gigantic table, a gigantic roof, like a fifth facade, you could say, but at the same time also as a figure like nature morte in French or still life. So together with Richard Vennet, the artist, we developed this figure of this in a way unnecessary roof-like figure. I mean, tilted with columns. I mean, as if the columns carry the roof, which is, I mean, perhaps also for the conversation later. I mean, which were not necessary, of course, these columns in some sense. And then these figures um, on the roof, part of them being very pragmatic ones, like kind of an element to bring in light, a hidden chimney, because the current idea about crematoria is that you can't see the chimney, you can't see the process, you can't see the smoke. So in a sense, a whole mise en scène of elements which try to bring in a message and at the same time organize the building accordingly. So here you see that in plan. It has a set of parallel bands which relate to the landscape. Some of them almost wall-like, kind of mm, which hide all kind of spaces which are serving the main spaces. Some, in a way, major spaces, going from two moments where people gather before they enter each of the two major rooms, and where the service happens, and where the coffin kind of goes afterwards to through here where you see the cremation happening, which is in a way a very private affair. Only 3-4 people related to the deceased have access here. So in a way, the crematorium for most people stops here. So the crematorium is its lowest here, it gets higher and higher. And it's very high here because it has this high space necessary to squeeze in all the machines and all the cleaning for the smoke and the air of course, what is that process, which has to be interestingly hidden. So this is the section, and in a way, as I just explained, so you have this. And this is in a way the machine. So it's also literally a machine in so much that this is non-insulated building, concrete, which in a way is very, very hot. Of course, in the cremation, a lot of heat is produced, and that heat heats the whole building, which is here the insulated part, which is odd. I can imagine when I tell this to people, sometimes they're like, really, wow, that's strange, but it's logical if you think about it. So this is the building, and I have to go fast, so I have to kind of give you a few glimpses. So this is in a way that figure that kind of now not yet realized Bas Smet's landscape, which I think in picture works very well with an artificial hill. It was a former brick factory which they demolished, and they left all these kind of remnants of what it was. You have this in a way planted forest, which is totally artificial because, as I said, it was boulders. um, you have people entering here, you see. Um, and you have here this set of these rooms, which are in a way, which stop a bit earlier. Why? Because you can actually get out, I mean, after the service through some of these walls, and then you're protected against the rain, and you get fresh air, and you contemplate, of course, what has happened before. So you see it here. Now, meanwhile, this was always the plan. These objects have been painted white, but not this one, but the front ones are, but I don't have pictures of that. White like here. I mean, same texture, same paint, but it wasn't ready. So what was for us interesting is that this building is, in a sense, is just this figure, is this roof. It's a sequence of these walls, which have endlessly changing kind of door rhythms, of which, in a way, again, is an extremely Spartan building. It's just concrete, the way it's built. It carries the roof, that's it. And then, in a way, the columns just carry the last little bit. It has these benches, which have also including all the, the air circulation, because, people are very emotional in this moment. So there's a lot of air circulation to make it work. And all this is fixed, as you can see. So it has this wall, which we designed also with Richard van Let, which divides what they call the family room, where people wait before people enter. This is the other room, in fact. So this is the big room, and this is the small room with the other light, the other wall, but the wall is similar. And you see all these elements, as you see this niche and this standard and so forth, they all have echoes, but none of them is really like what you imagine maybe it was in other more specific places in the past. So it's like an accumulation of figures and forms, of which the last figure and form is this big oven, as you can see here, one of the two, which is currently standing there, gathered as a big collection of figures under the roof of the crematorium, as you see here. Now, this roof as a gathering element, this big wall, this big element, this kind of protection, is perhaps what the crematorium, what connects the crematorium with this building, which is a brewery in Brussels. And as different as the context can be, in a way, there's more similar than different, really. It's a big building. I mean, certainly for its context, you will see that in one of the last pictures. It's the result of the desire by the city of Brussels to not totally expel production from its kind of territory, which is an interesting ambition. It's something which they have trouble succeeding in, because everything you see here will be transformed in big housing blocks, condominiums, and so forth. I think that's also very much what's currently happening in Williamsburg or Brooklyn, or further away even. I think you know it better than me. But it's but of course, this idea that a kind of curated, call it, am I allowed to call it, a hipster version of economy and production is somehow still allowed, of course, fitted perfectly this idea of a brewery settling, claiming to use the canal for its own transport, which so far they don't do, but nevertheless, I mean, the desire is there. and of course, in one go, actually radically transforming the context, which I think one can even ask questions about. So this is the one. This is the brewery, 280. Their office numbers. Sorry. This weird brewery has all funny kind of labels for their beer. You can see that. Full disclaimer: I never drink beer, but I mean, nevertheless. But then again, I also don't hope to die soon, and I don't look at television. So, we always think that it's good to do things and I also don't have satellites. So, the good news is when you design for things you don't fully understand. So here, their logos are like this. They change all the time. They always come with a new idea, and then they have another color, and so forth. It was a competition, and we thought, what do you do with this? I mean, we actually made the pitch. It was maybe possible to make an almost tent-like roof. You see the references here below. They were there. I mean, they're not invented later. I mean, they're always somehow vaguely on our mind. I mean, could you make this kind of figure, which was kind of vaguely referring to that, but of course not the victim of the fact that tomorrow they change colors again. So we came with a kind of fairly random kind of order of an amount of colors we had spotted on their bottles. So that's what we suggested in a building which was placed here in an interesting urban spot. I mean, which in a way always would be extremely visible from all sides. And would indeed almost be tent-like. We were very fascinated by this Pomona temple of Shinkel, a building where in a way, ultimately the roof is the protagonist. And this may be not the best picture, but in some other views, you always see this roof, it always takes your attention. Interesting, interesting. So can you do the same? And of course, there's always this weird pragmatism. I mentioned it, even in Switzerland, there's this pragmatism. I mean, everything's always done with less money than you wish for, which is cool, which is interesting, because you have to reduce your kind of toolbox. So in a sense, we said we build a big wall with a few openings, 4 in total, more or less symmetrical. The wall originally was a rectangle, became kind of a losange shape. We have this roof. It takes all the attention, like a MacGuffin in a sense. The roof is enormous, hangs over the wall, and makes a kind of weird sensation of inside and outside. And it has this kind of strange sense of festivity. So here you see the building ready. Of course, in Bas Prinsen's pictures, you don't see all these people, but here you see them. They exist, these people. Kind of a beer garden in full function here. And here about the plan, it's very simple. And the architecture is really about, after defining this figure and after defining the roof and deciding that the roof has to be so colorful and from all sides, and then problems of how is the edge of such a colorful roof. You probably saw it already. It's kind of mirror. You can see that. Then how do you organize a space? So we came with a set of elements, in a way, tables. The tables always have round columns and kind of particular beam sections. So you can recognize them as tables so that the infill looks different. Because let's not forget, the building itself is built out of concrete panels in steel structure, which also has columns. And we don't want these to look like these. So in the end, architecture and showing what you want to say is about paint almost, or putting attention to certain things. Again, I lose it always when I stand here. I should never walk here anymore. So here you have these tables up, and here you see these tables in a way with all these vats and the whole process and the canning here below. You see the building, you see the big openings. You see it again, like very much this picture with this strange smoke. I mean, so you see the roof sticks out on one side here, and you'll see it later on the other side there because of the losange shape. It has these 4 big windows who have nothing to do with interior. You see, it doesn't fit at all. I mean, but they're always the same size. And the tables, I mean, this table is, for example, that high, so they kind of reveal aspects. So that also makes it easy to include all kind of other things like these grills. They're all fine because these windows take all the attention. Everything is made with this kind of a greenhouse kind of technology, meaning cheap. And of course, again, this corrugated, I mean, and you can see even that is pragmatic. The colors are simply per size of panels. So, I mean, you don't paint them afterwards. No, they're pre-painted. They put in, the only thing they had to paint was the beam and decide whether the beam is this color or the next color. So you see it here. You see inside, you see all the machines. What's interesting, perhaps, in this, I mean, I introduced this idea of the roof as protecting a collection of things. And of course, the collection of things is very different in the crematorium than here. But ultimately, here you have a collection of machines. And you could argue that in terms of material and in terms of detail, what's here and what's there is quite similar. It's all about kind of putting the stress on something, making you understand something as something and something as something else. So here you see that the round column of the table, another round column of the table, but then here you see this HEB profile of the so-called concrete wall. So here you see it again. So in a way, it's all about kind of endlessly kind of establishing these hierarchies. There are these offices on one of these tables. Here again, it is crazy amount of ducting, which in the end we all have to help them design. Of course, that's the joke, huh? But I mean, that's also interesting. And then the big opening here, and then here the window. You see, and here again the same big roof towards this context. You see how big this building is. In fact, you see how small this context is, which is very quickly transforming. So the brewery. So the brewery moves me to this building, which is an administrative building, but that doesn't matter so much. It could be anything, I guess, but it's an office building. It's for the province, so it's in a way it's kind of national or kind of provincial kind of government body. Um, it's a building in a very similar context than the one before. It's another city. It's called Kortrijk. Um, that's the model of the building. But the building, as it presents itself to you here tonight and to other people, perhaps in reality, in a way, does not immediately reveal its major, I would care to call it secret, which is that the building already existed before. So you see that building here, and the building was always there. And if one has to find an example of what we believe is the ultimate architecture, I already tried with a few this evening, and here yet another one. So because it's an architecture which was the exact same function before and after we came, we didn't do anything really. I mean, we just made a new building out of an old building, and hence, there's other buildings which did that, which is okay, which is a good company, of course. So this is the existing building as it was 2015. The building was working. It had exactly the same program as it has today, but it had big I would say um, energy problems. I mean, it was, as you can see, all built out of concrete, no insulation, even the infrastructure, the core and everything was on the outside. Windows were just put in. It was unimaginable to move on with this building, especially since it was for the government. Now, the weird decision was when we did an analysis and said, look, the building is so expensive to renovate, you might better demolish it, that they figured out that demolishing the building would mean that in this area they couldn't build an office building anymore. So then the government decided to keep it, because then they could have their offices still there. So we said, okay, then you have to completely redo it and make it a kind of zero energy building in some way. But so the beauty of it is that we reduced it to this very frail, very vulnerable skeleton, which is here, and we build a new building around it. So this is the building around it. So this is the existing plan, and this is the building around it. So we reduced it to the structure. We got rid of all the cores. We got rid of all the walls, and we built all these vertical columns around it, which are only ducts. They're not structural. I mean, yes, of course they carry themselves, but they're in a way only ducts, and they have these plates, which they also carry, which are mediating solar gains and are kind of mediating how light and sun comes in. Now back to get here. So here you see it, the building after it's been stripped. Here the new building built in front of it, and we kind of course, we were very fascinated by making a building which looks bigger than, I mean, it looks weirder, which looks almost like older than the building it tries to protect. So that's what it does. Here you see that. It does not fit at all the rhythm, but it has its own rhythm. You can see that. The only moment it shows that it's in a way a fake building is here, because we moved one to make the opening, the entrance to the building. So all the rest follows. And as you can see a little bit, if you see the different images, all sides, all facades are different. The rhythm is different, the openings are different, and that's purely because of the calculations of the solar and light gains. So in a way, it's a totally parametric building, imagine. I mean, well, somehow. But it's serious. So so you see that also the plates are hardly ever terraces. Sometimes we made them accessible, but in most of the cases, they're just perforated plates to mediate the light. Here you see the plan in context. You see, here's actually the landscape is done by Land in Zicht, with who we also work, which we think did a very nice project here. And so here you see we pushed in the core. All these columns are all working ducts. So this is the existing, this is the new. We put the machines on top, and and make these plates, as you can see. Obviously, this is the south and this is the north. And here you see it again. And here you see it under construction. So here you see literally the structure of the building, and you see the new building, the new and the old building coinciding. Here you see indeed these hollow columns, which are in a way for the ducts and the ventilation. And here you see it finished with the ventilation panels behind the old structure of the building, which is painted white. And here the perforations outside. Inside. And an artwork by Rita McBride called Vent, which we thought was very interesting. We convinced the client in their kind of 1% art program to acquire this work by her, which we believe kind of expresses in a way everything the building wants to be. So an architecture which is only this, which is no function, no program, just a box, the same organization, same everything. Everything one is supposed to do in architecture, it doesn't. The only thing it does, it's like a new pullover. Architecture as a new pullover. So with this pullover, we move to students. Here there's another new pullover, but it's more than that, I hope, almost like a house. Maybe this pullover of before, that one is also somehow like a big house, no? A new house with its windows and its terraces and so forth. And that house-like building is maybe somehow related to this project here, which is a new architecture faculty in Liège in Belgium again, the French-speaking part of Belgium. It's a competition we won last year, where in a sense, I mean, we actually did two competitions for architecture faculties. One we lost and one we won. One was for Ghent, our own alma mater, actually our own school. We were very sad. And then Liège we won, so we sympathize with them much more, as you can imagine. Either way, so here you have Liège. It's another of these weird places in a sense. You know, it's a modernist city along the river, and then in the same time it's a very old city, and it's sprawl and it's many things, and it's very unclear to understand now where is the center. So is it this gigantic Calatrava station here? Probably not. Is it this kind of weird island in the middle of which, in a way, the complex here, the campus, which is a former, actually it's a former convent turned into military barracks, turned into kind of a cluster of buildings, turned into half a school, which is here. And it's another of these, in a way, places which tries to kind of fight for its own centrality. So we thought that was interesting. And so this idea of centrality, also this complex, this whole cluster, this caserne, as they said, which is built several amount of buildings which have a kind of historicist idea of themselves, but are ultimately already second or third rate or layer because of the convent which originally organized this place. There's hardly anything left, let alone of the big church which was part of that convent. Either way, so here you have this place which is different buildings. This is a manege turned into a cultural center. These are buildings which are now all university, art school, architecture faculty, and something which could be a big court. That's why I think this image is here. I mean, what is the center? What are we talking about? So we thought more than anything, and there's a bit of Matt Kelly, it's always nice. I mean, is it possible to make a project which is not so much about here, because that's what the architecture was, but is about this, or at least this here, and trying to understand this court, which really enough was property of the architecture faculty, but there's nothing of them there. And then there's this manege, as I told, this cultural building, art school. Can we appropriate this court? I think that was really the thought. And then there's a couple of strategies. No, I mean, how much can you spread your architecture so you can appropriate? I think that was really the thought here. So it's a very beautiful example, especially this wing, which we all know, which is now in a way sadly a bit destroyed because of this wall, these balconies, and then now it's kind of all closed in glass, of course. Um, the idea of the courtyard, it's kind of bizarre courtyard, and then well, a bit of constructivism. You always kind of it's nice to have the chance to bring it back in some way, and of course you can do that because you talk, hey, architecture school guys. I mean, it's architecture history. What are we? Where are we? What can we do? So we did a couple of tests, finding ways to deal with this court, trying to fill it completely. Build a building on the end and so forth. Long story short, we came with this rather bizarre proposal. I mean, at least I think they first thought it was a bit bizarre. Very long building here for the students. So we said architecture faculty is essentially a place to, yeah, almost to live, meaning you work all the time. You're there on your computer, on your drawings, on your laptop, on your phone. I don't know what you do now. I mean, we do all these kind of things, I guess, but also to find, and I mean, I was bringing it up and I didn't talk enough about this, to find some kind of real place, a reality. Is it possible to make kind of the architecture faculty, not so much here within the classrooms and I don't know, the Fab Lab and stuff like that. No, here. And this building, that was our main intervention, the very, very long stretch building, appropriating the court is the place for the ateliers, the studio building, as you can see it here. So these are the first versions. I mean, this idea, the court, we work here with the Vigne together, but maybe doing another building here, demolishing a bit and making a hall here, let's say a court, cores and hall, and then the long slab. So you see it in all its variants. And then we gradually realized we wanted to make this building also very much in a very simple gesture, like say a wall to pin up, a window to look outside. That's also how we explained it to them. So we have here the existing situation with, I mean, some containers here and a nondescript space. And then here and after kind of our kind of fourth layer addition is kind of building. This is the competition model with the big core here, which we now move there, but that's detail. It's also this plus this, the learning center, plus that the library and so forth, and plus that the hall, but that's maybe less important in this conversation. And then this idea of, yeah, this very long, narrow building, in a way, a building almost too long and too narrow to be ecologically, economically sound today. But then again, you talk cross ventilation, you talk kind of extreme reduction of building materials. You talk Belvedere, and you have like literally just spaces, a wall, and a ground floor space with administration and some shared space. So in the back, you see that wall literally as a wall, like a white paper. And Joris Kritis, graphic designer, who we often work, proposed to literally turn this into like a page. You see, like Faculté d'Architecture in French, but I mean, interrupted by our core, and then the hall here, and then in here, then the hall with again the opening and the existing buildings around it. I would say unashamedly different from what there is, because well, because of the modernist tradition, perhaps of Liège, of Luck, but also simply because I mean, this complex which has been built with all these layers could perfectly have another layer. So we were lucky. They believed us, and we won the competition. So now we're working on this, and this is in a way still the competition drawings. But I mean, actually have now a newer set, so to start constructing this soon. So, but this court was for us very fascinating. That despite the enormity of the gesture, that ultimately it was about this. And the fact that a building, in a way, despite its size, might be about something else. I use here as a stepping stone to this one, which is another media building. And I go fast because, in a way, the building is interesting. We're building it, all good. It's big, all good. But I mean, ultimately, it's about this on the one hand, and then this. And also the very fact that a building so big might have another role to play, that it's this interior, it is place in the place, yes, sure. It's also a building here, like you see here. This is actually, this is the current set of buildings of the Belgian radio and television. Um, Actually, in Belgium, politics are complicated, and I mean, it was once national, but now it's cut into two kind of cultural parts. The Flemish own this side, and the French own that side. I mean, this is kind of strange in this very long building, but it's how it works. Of course, it doesn't work. That's why they decided to demolish this whole building and build two new buildings here. I think you could see it on the model picture, if I'm not mistaken. Um, if I come back, yeah, you see this is the, yeah, this is the other building, and this is the Flemish, the Walloon, the French-speaking building. Yeah, voila. And so then they will demolish this whole thing, and this will become a big park. And that's interesting. So you have to build a building here, temporarily, in a way, hidden behind all this. And then the moment it's finished, and I mean, people have moved, this becomes in a way a building mediating as an urban figure in its enormity, because a big building is 100 by 100 meter. It mediates or it announces some kind of park. So I would say the evident reference is this. You see this Caprarola, this Farnese Villa. I mean, you're not pretending to be, Vignola, don't get me wrong, but I mean, just the very idea of a building which kind of mediates between the park and the village or the city. Now we are talking about the city of Brussels, but nevertheless, and mediates between the mineral and the not so mineral. So a building which in its kind of compactness, and in that sense, I think very different from the first radio and television I showed in Lausanne. I mean, it's almost, it's kind of fortress-like. At the same time, and here you have some Mulliken again, we were lucky because we managed to get Mulliken in the building. So not only did we already somehow anticipate it with our color scheme, but we could get him into an art intervention inside. I mean, that's later, not now, but later. What interesting with Mulliken I find is this kind of, it's this idea of making this world, this kind of this set of these five colors. I mean, these different aspects of his world. Um, and that all in one building, which is in a way, of course, a building which wants to mimic the world, which is a media building inside. So here you see that. It's a very simple, in a way, building, very compact. It's fortress-like, like here, fortress, with almost no light in the middle, only boxes, and only on the sides, the lodges and the public entrances and the restaurant and all this kind of stuff, like a very, very dense, compact building, octagon of about 100-meter diameter, on top of which there's a 100 by 100 box, which is just gardens. And whereas, I mean, the top is kind of mat-like, of course not, but it's a bit mat-like. It's mat-like in so much that it wants to be horizontal and tries to find solutions in these patios over 3 floors with its steps to be as horizontal as possible and not design anything else. And the bottom is extremely architectural. It's everything is designed, everything is fixed. And it's also interesting in a debate about what media is. Here we don't even know how they make it. The small studios, media studios, radio studios, television studios, new media studios, they have been changing already for a year and a half since we actually started now working and now building this building. Whereas here, this is old school. This is like a theater. This is event hall, big recording hall, entrance area, restaurant. This is tangible, this is real, and that's why also I think these are interesting, from the kind of ephemeral, open, loose, to very massive, very real. So if you move again, so here you see that you have this kind of octagon on top of which there's this pizza box, in a sense. It's just a kind of metallic pizza box in a way. um, You see it here from the back. You see also that we use the topography to have a kind of a logistic thing, where the trucks were kind of mixed with students in Lausanne. Here, they're totally not. It's a different world. See that plan? You see the entrance area. You see that plan. You see this event hall. And you see the plans above. And I find these plans above are fascinating because it brings me to my last 2.5 projects, I think, which is these gardens, you know, the garden in a way as the only organization of the building. The garden you see here, and you see how deep or how not deep it gets through this canyon, which I don't talk about now, but I mean, which is here. Actually, the other part of the building which is under it. See it here, the canyon, whatever, media, lots of media, and the garden. Now, this garden, and perhaps if it's a house, because that's how we sold it. I mean, in Belgium, in fact, in Flanders, they call it uh, het, uh, het huis van vertrouwen. It's the house of what you say you can trust. I mean, somehow that was always the name they had. So we said it's a house, but a house with many allotments, but the allotments happen around the garden. So in a way, we couldn't design anything else here. I mean, we don't know how these walls happen. Now we have already designed them many times. They're endlessly renegotiating because they reorganized it all the time. But the gardens stay as almost like the most important center of that house. So here, gardens and house as a micro intermezzo. It's a housing project in Ghent, which we're now currently building, which is an old complex, which we in a way revived by extending it as a set of houses, houses not only for America, houses in the tradition of other projects we did, but then very different, not just a set of rooms 9 by 9, 10 by 10, but in a way a set of empty spaces and a set of houses, like little warehouses. You see it here. Oh, go fast. So, you know, there's this kind of collection of houses, sequence of houses, announcing what I will show in a second. Houses around gardens. You see them here, like these houses. So collective housing, and I didn't show any of our typical housing schemes, but where often rooms organize houses and sequence of rooms and enfilades of rooms. Here's in a way an enfilade of little buildings, an enfilade of little warehouses. You see them here, which in a way occupy the whole terrain in ignorance of their immediate context. Here you see them under construction. But also garden like this, in a way, big house, which is a big house in a small city, and not a large city. It's a library. And this library, I think what for me here is interesting to show is that this figure, which is essentially an ignorant, enclosed, in a way, a little bit stubborn figure, a figure of a building with almost no windows and just a garden, is in a way, I would say, an attempt to redefine the public building in a small city as a big house. So this big house is, in this case, as a library, is a building made by bookshelves. You see it here. The shelves carry the roof, which was a nightmare, but we somehow succeeded. It's also a building in negotiation with a school in the back. A quarter of the building is classrooms of the school. That's the only way in this, weirdly enough, rich neighborhood, but where nobody pays taxes, they could kind of succeed, because they're all here because they don't have to pay taxes, of course, but then they cannot afford public amenities, so they have to make a deal with the school. So what happens? Anyways, there's a garden around which the school and its shared program and the library negotiate. In the first version, the garden was almost shared, and we realized, of course, that you do not want people entering the library, spending the whole day looking at small kids. I mean, you know, there's a serious danger there. So now you will see that in the plan. It's cut out and it touches, but there's a kind of an ambivalent relationship. See it here. This is, in a way, a quarter slice. The garden, the library. Here, work by Richard Vennet, who's again here involved in this project. You see earlier iterations, and this idea of a kind of a figure of a house with a strange roof, in a way too big, but somehow, maybe should have showed that better, somehow relating to this context with these large houses, rich people in too big houses. And then here, somehow our library also too big, but because of its strange circular shape, it reads very differently. So here you see the library, you see in a way the public space around the school, a complex negotiation again done by Björn of Landinzicht. the school, which maybe later will anyhow transform, but and the figure which tries to be autonomous, which tries to be part of it, but not really. It tries to show that it belongs. You will see that through the windows, but at the same time, it takes a distance. So here you see that court, the reading room, because it started like that. The brief for the competition, it was a competition, was to make a library with a reading garden. Now you think you don't build a library and then next to it a garden with a fence. That makes no sense. So can you put the garden inside the library and turn the library in a way as the background of the garden? That's what happened. And then can you cut this piece of, I mean, a refectory and a stair to a couple of extra classrooms in direct relationship, 1, 2, 3 windows to that school. Then there's a fourth window here and then the door and then no windows, nothing. So a big house is a public building, like a house with a garden, but with a threshold. You see here the top rooms, the garden. See the house again, huh? The library. With the garden somehow visible from the street. They're just new pictures. The building is just finished. I mean, there's not yet any vegetation. There's one with a little bit more, but you see, it's just really just there. You see here these set of windows, and when there's a door, we just have a third of the window. Yeah, just with an aluminium plate, which is the door. So you see it here. See here, that's the entrance. That's the door. This window is just shows the books. See it here again. And inside, and these very high spaces you see here. And yeah, the shelves which literally carry the wall, which is of course the drama with this is that you have to design a building which has the precision of cabinetry for a building, which makes no sense. So you have to find out. You can make your shelves a little bit less precise, and your building a bit more precise. So you have to kind of find the middle ground to make this building possible. It took us about a year to negotiate that with the contractors, but it worked. So here you see that. I mean, there's ultimately a lot of pragmatism. I mean, it's simple, it's wood. The whole building is made out of wood. It's just plastered on the outside. You saw that the early pictures have a red facade that was brick, but then we realized if you do all this effort for this wooden building, you just do insulation plaster. So, I mean, we often say our buildings are born naked, and I believe that has to do with the fact that we're not dogmatically embracing a certain materiality. I mean, it's like it's how you maneuver yourself to its final realization. So here you see that. I think this garden brings us, and I think this picture already shows at least some kind of vegetation, to the last project, and then I close, which is, I mean, the garden and the house finally, perhaps as an idea of inhabiting the garden as the only solution to that search for the real, like the reality, as I said. So when I started in the beginning with a highly artificial program of radiant television, tried to explain that somehow you try to create a complex interior as an answer to an impossible context to respond to, find its own reality, perhaps. Then, via roofs and spaces and elements of protection, we move towards these gardens. And this garden I find is particular because it's a garden in a sense as a world. It's a small house, it's not very big. It's a house for a divorced parent with 2 kids, of which one kid is heavily disabled, uses a wheelchair. And it's at the same time a house in a way in a very green neighborhood in Brussels. You see it here. It's a bit dark picture, but many trees. The street is somewhere here. The plot is, flag-like in some sense. And so it's a house for this kid in the first place, for the parent, of course, also, and the sister of that kid. But it's also for that kid specifically a house because it's his world. It's basically the only place he can see. So we were thinking, how can you make a building which does not embrace disability as something to show off as something you would immediately recognize, you know, showing, I don't know, the movable platform of the wheelchair or something like that. No, is it possible to make a house where if you don't know because the kid's not always there, divorced parents, that you wouldn't even notice, you wouldn't see? And we thought, is it possible to use this different dimension and at the same time understand this house as a possibility to make everything as maximum accessible? So very quickly became this idea. I mean, it was strange enough as a competition, a long story, but nevertheless, um, a house which had like placed itself in a not so big plot and made everything in a way as a sequence accessible. You can in a way move around, come in, come out, and go over the center, go back in. So in a way, this view on this, in a way, sliver of nature is anticipates this park, because there's a big forest and big park close by for that kid. So moving from a set of walls organizing the space to a set of rooms to all kind of other incarnations, um, and understanding it as in a way two houses, one of the parent and the kids, and then maybe another one for later, which is now currently not built and probably never built. It doesn't matter. So in a sense, but then here this house, which is not on the street, as I said, but somehow in the middle of houses, but in the middle of a construction of nature. It's also a house, in other words, which has to not only deal with that dimension and to a certain extent turn this dimension into a kind of new natural law or something that was important for us, but also dealing with this proximity and the mise en scène of endless nature. So the garden as the goal. So the house, not just the house, one facade, let's say anyway, a whole set of same sliding doors everywhere, but also some kind of strange hat. You know, you have these hats in England in this kind of horse races, these gigantic hats with all kind of stuff on them. I mean, well, we thought that was interesting, this kind of hat as an idea. And maybe in that hat, a few hidden spaces for the daughter, for the nanny, for the guy also, in order to escape sometimes this idea of this one world. So that's the house. So in that sense, the house also as a collection of things, and this is a project I will not talk about, but that's another little project of ours, collection. I guess this shows collection. And so back to the house and its different corners and its particular plan. So voila, here we have that. It has, in a way, always these rooms which are related to this outside. It has this leftover room, which always is triangles, everywhere triangles. Sometimes it's entrance to, sometimes a bathroom, many of these things. And sometimes these rooms are combined in this strange pool, which is not really a pool. It's just a very hot bath for the kid because he needs to have like this water, almost like 40 degrees, in order every day to keep his bones moving. So it's a very strange medical place, but at the same time pretends to be a house, pretends to be a set of walls, pretends to be a set of openings, pretends to be a floor, a roof, and a garden. And that's it. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. It's an extraordinary range of projects, and and I hope I was able to do justice to some of the ideas that are kind of intrinsic to your practice. As I was walking off stage, you said something about dirty, and I want to make sure that I didn't get something completely off. But explain to me uh, what you were thinking.
Oh well, yeah. Good question. No, I thought it was interesting because I saw a lot of truth in what you were observing. Meaning, if there's figures, the figures never autonomously re-emphasize their presence. I think we allow them to get dirty, so to speak. I mean, you were talking about the house in Buggenhout, which I didn't show here,
Yeah, yeah.
or other projects. But that's even true for with the projects I hope I showed today, because I wanted to show a couple of new projects. But I think our interest in geometry, which is obviously there, or type, or figures, which is all there, I think is somehow compensated by the desire to allow life to unfold, to make it happen, yeah, it's not mutation because it's not that, but I mean, first of all, I think there's very often various families of ideas and things which clash with each other, and somehow you always have to choose, right? I mean, somehow in a project, these families stay in their clash. I think the project happens. That's the complexity. But then, as soon as they're there, I suspect, um, yeah, they get dirty.
Uh, Tell me a little bit more about your approach to urbanism, because as you were explaining, you begin by articulating interior strategies and then allowing them to propel on the context. But the reality is that at the end of the day, the pragmatism to which you speak allows uh, a full engagement with the context. So, from a methodological perspective, and here I'm interested in the question from a pedagogical point of view, what might be different in starting with, let's say, the old fashioned contextual approach that results in the very same interior configurations that you end up with? How is it that you dispense with the context in that initial moment, and why is that important?
Well, I think your question is well formulated. I think it has to do with an initial moment. I do not think it. I mean, there's no. I mean, the initial no moment is not a reality. It's an aspect of a process. I also see that, for example, in our teachings or something. I mean, I very often ask students, like, just throw something. You make something, and then that new project, say this water bottle, find its dialogue with the place, and the bottle changes and the place changes, because analyzing a place without building is difficult, because the moment the building is there, the place will change. So, I mean, to put it black and white. So I think this, of course, a lot of it is rhetorics, huh? But let's say the idea that the building will never succeed in solving properly might inspire you to come with the building first. And now the question is, what is a building? Because, of course, today, in discourse, a lot is changing. I mean, first of all, I think in many situations today, the answer might not be a building. I mean, that's also how you saw that, to a certain extent, the argument might shift from the building to the garden. The question is, of course, if that doesn't result in a building altogether, or a transformed building, or an altered building, or a renovated building, and so forth. So, no, I think it's more to do with defining the project, and I think our project, I hope, is always spatial, and that space might be a big interior, might be a succession of places, might be the garden, might be an interrelationship. But of course, ultimately, say if I take the library is in the city, even if it's a small city, and it's next to the school. So all these factors play a role. You cannot deny that.
What is curious about the architects that are interested in urbanism, and I believe you are,
Mm-hmm.
is that, at least in part, they're divided into two. There are the urbanists that accept and acquiesce to forces of planning the city to the point that architecture becomes invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question of control is very much at
Mhm.
stake. And within the other camp, I would say you're right there, is that whether you're doing a house or you're doing an institutional building of some gravity, the presence of the figure
Mhm.
invariably monumentalizes whatever that is being built. In the domestic context, it aggrandizes the house.
Mhm.
In the library, it takes a domestic structure but enlarges it further. And in the context of some of the media buildings, of course, the transformation of the figure invariably becomes a matte building, which is
Mhm.
something that you've sort of rehearsed
Mhm. Yeah.
time and time over again as a kind of micro urbanism. But then the control comes into precisely because you cannot control urbanism as such, that architecture is the only thing that you can lean into. So can you develop that? Is that a defensive strategy, or is it yet another embodiment of the pragmatism that you speak of?
Well, it's a question with many layers, I think, but I'll try to answer to a couple of them. No, I think first of all, we are interested in urbanism. Yes, so we are in that category of people. uh, Second, it's true that we are not urbanists who desperately believe in rules and description and hence kill, in my opinion, architecture. So I think architecture builds the city, so to speak. I mean, I mean, an extreme simplistic camp. We come from Rossi's corner in some sense. I mean, of course, it's simplistic because it's more nuanced than that, but or Ungers or whatever. I mean, I think that's where we somehow that's a corner we partly inhabit. I do think that that corner needs to be updated, and I hope we are updating that corner a bit with our own work. And I think a lot of the updates, and although I do believe that it was very apparent in Rossi, and that's also why we made that book, The Urban Fact, is that then if you move to architecture, I mean, in the project within that discourse, I think the project very often is a mise en scène of the hypothetical best urban solution. But I think and that's where the everything comes back of the very beginning. I think I do not want to sound cynical because I'm really not. I think I'm very positive in towards the world, and we should contribute to the world. Very important. But we do have to understand, I would say, what we can and we cannot reach. So I think architecture often, in my opinion, even if it's big building, uh, of the cultural realm, if I would call it like that, that kind of architecture, often at most succeeds in doing a mise en scène, a kind of a model of an idea. So that's where architecture ultimately is hyper curated, despite the fact that it might be typological or might be figure oriented or might be urban in its desire. I think despite all these desires, and I think you can see that very much in, say, I think one of the best projects Rossi ever did, in my opinion, the Faiano Luna School, which I showed,
Yeah.
which is an absolute masterpiece. I think it's in a way today it's quite trashy and it's a bit sad, but nevertheless, it's a very beautiful project. There you see what it's about. It's architecture which has to do all the effort to make us understand what the urban figure would like to do. So I think that's where architecture enters, and that goes to the point of painting one column blue and the other one red. I mean, that's the strange thing of architecture. I think that that kind of architecture, which I think we are very much part of, that kind of genre, if I would call it that way, um, will always make a model of a building.
Um,
I was sitting in one actually, but okay, that's another bit. Um,
I think you've been around long enough to have witnessed several tendencies. You even referred to parametrics with the wryness of your humor, but given that you teach given that you produce knowledge and given that you are very much invested in the production of buildings itself, what do you think are some of the largest dangers of pedagogy today as you see them, and how they differ from maybe 10, 20 years ago? And given the obvious global urgencies,
Mm.
what do you think are the real urgencies from your perspective?
It's a fundamental question. I don't know if I have the right answers, which I think, by the way, is already an important thing. That way, I think we should stand also ourselves as educators. We should position ourselves from the perspective that we might not have the right answers, which partly has to do, of course, with a generational shift. I think we have to be aware of that. I mean, for example, when I grew up as a young architect with my, say, colleagues, which were back then young architects like me. We had the desire to save architecture discipline from the ones who apparently ignored the whole culture of it. I mean, that's what we felt, and that's now almost, it's close to 20 years ago when we thought we had to start that fight. I mean, I remember 2000, so yeah, two or something. Indeed, one, two, three. That was the beginning of a disco of an argument. Let's draw drawings. Let's look back at the 70s. Like look back at how axonometric drawings were made. Let's understand that any architecture project had a precedent, an ancestor, and so forth, and so forth. What was this culture 50 years, 100 years, 400 years, 1,000 years ago? I think that aspect is, of course, part of my own culture. So I think I can still teach that. Sorry, and that's important. I think. I think we should not let go on culture, especially in times like these where think culture is thrown out of the window too easily. I think that's fundamental for us also as architects. Having said that, I mean, there are obviously, ecological and economical challenges and identity challenges, I think. Now, the only thing I believe is important is that we are not forgetting ever that there's a lot of people with hardly any money and very few with very much money. And I think architecture can help in that redistribution. I think it's easier to play a role there than to give the right answer to ecology, because currently many ecological questions are, representation. So how can we go beyond representation? How can I go beyond the building with the solar panels being better than the one without, or I don't know, the green vertical terraces being the solution? So I think again, from academia, we are there and we can maybe investigate. That whatever durability, long livability, and stuff like that goes beyond these easy tropes. So I think that's really important. And then I think what is fundamental to architecture culture, I believe, but to culture in general, is ambivalence, is ambiguity, is not black or white, but many things at the same time, a certain complexity, right? And I hope that when I present a project, I somehow hinted at a building is many things. Is some things you did not know it was, and some things you really wanted it to be, and some other things which came as a consequence. And then all of a sudden somebody walks in and say, "Oh, but no, that's what it was." And that ambiguity, that ambivalence, is so fundamental. I think if we want to survive in our societies, if we want to live together, if we want to embrace all cultures, we have to accept that there's misunderstandings and they're beautiful, that there's false friends, as they have language, the typical language translation thing, and that some great ideas are based on wrong interpretations. And I think that's what we have to teach. I think that's fundamental.
I'm mindful of the time, but I'm also using the kind of the nuanced response as a wonderful ending for this event. So thank you so much.
Thank you.